Would you join me in welcoming Andy Puzder?
Thank you, Donna. It's a pleasure to be here. Great to see everybody. What a great turnout. I'm going to have to talk really fast because this is a 40-minute presentation. I'm going to give it to you in about 25. So I apologize if I'm rushing over things. But as Donna said, I became the CEO of a company. It's known as CKE Restaurants. It owned Hardee's and Carl's Jr. It was an international restaurant corporation. But I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. My dad, when I was growing up, my dad was a Ford car salesman, a World War II combat vet. My grandfather had come to this country from the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1912, leaving his home, his family, his friends, to try and find a better life, to try and find more opportunity. And thank God he did, because he put me in position where I could find more opportunity. Like my grandfather, I wanted to do more in my life. I was a working class kid growing up, but people that are about my age, I'll be 70 in July, you probably remember that back then, nobody really thought about being working class. It seemed like everybody was working class, right? The kids in school were working class, the kids on TV were working class, who knew? But I knew I wanted to do something else. I wanted to lift myself out of the working class and move on to do other things. And eventually I was able to, because I lived in a country where you had the opportunity to lift yourself up. And eventually I became an attorney, went to Washington University here in St. Louis, and then the CEO of, as I said, an international restaurant corporation that owned 3,800 restaurants in 45 states and 40 foreign countries. And my last year, we did $4.3 billion in revenue. Now, there isn't another country in the history of the world where a working class kid like me could have aspired to that level of success with any reasonable chance of achieving it. It happened because I lived here, and because we had a capitalist economic system. Had I been born in a socialist country, the idea of lifting myself from the working class, more likely the working poor, would either never have occurred to me, or if it had occurred to me, it would have seemed like an impossible dream. What's distressing today is that young Americans, particularly millennials, seem to prefer socialism to capitalism. There was a recent Gallup poll that showed 51% preferred capitalism, 45% preferred socialism. 10 years ago, 68% of young Americans preferred capitalism. That's a 23 percentage point drop. That's a huge decline in a decade. And the problem is, nobody's really told these kids what socialism and capitalism actually are. There was another poll by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation that found that 69% of millennials couldn't accurately define capitalism or socialism. That's 7 out of 10. Millennials they love socialism, they just have no idea what it is. So I always start these presentations with where is it? Where's my slides? Are they going to come up? And then I'll push buttons and nothing will happen. That looks like it. Let's go to the next one. Why isn't it going? Am I doing something wrong? There we go. So I start out by explaining to kids, socialism is an economic system where the means of production, distribution, and exchange are owned or controlled through taxation and regulation by the government. And that capitalism is simply an economic system where those same building blocks are owned and controlled by individuals. But the opinion of millennials seems to be that socialism is based on benevolence, but capitalism is based on greed. Now, this seems simple enough. But their belief is that if you're a capitalist, if you don't support the new democratic socialist candidates like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and you don't go out and fight every day to reduce income inequality, that you're somehow a greedy and selfish capitalist. So where did that come from? Well, it goes back about 100 years. The progressives have been arguing this for about 100 years. But remember back in 1987, there was a movie, and there's supposed to be a slide that shows it, but it's Gordon Gekko, right, he said, this is Hollywood's version of capitalism, where Gordon says, greed is good. That's Michael Douglas playing Gordon Gekko. Well, outside of Hollywood, greed is not good. And capitalism is not based on greed. Capitalism is an economic system that incentivizes you to improve your life by improving the life of other people. Capitalism takes your desire to improve your life and funnels it out to others, your customers. If the only way you succeed in a capitalist economy is by satisfying consumers, American consumers in this case in our country, but consumers in general. When I ran CKE restaurants, we were always trying to figure out what you wanted and how we could give it to you at a price you could afford. How could we give you what you wanted at a price you could afford to pay? We spent millions of dollars a year trying to figure out how to do that. And if we didn't do it, our competitors would have literally eaten our lunch, right? Think about your local grocery store, or your local shopping mall, or the Amazon warehouse, right? This is every product, at the thousands and thousands of products, every product, the bright colors, the fancy wording, they're all, I don't know why that is making that noise. Stop, stop, stop. That's my watch, which I can barely use other than to tell time. But the thousands of products on the shelf, each product represents an individual, an entrepreneur, trying to convince you that they have what you want at a price you can afford, right? It's the purest form of democracy. It's economic democracy. You vote with every dollar you spend on what businesses succeed and what businesses fail. So we've got this tremendous energy out there with entrepreneurs trying to figure out what you want and to convince you they have it at a price you can afford. And you out there voting with every dollar you spend as to who succeeds and who fails. Now, if you come up with something like the iPhone, and just think, we've got this iPhone, right? I've got mine here. That's probably one of my, right? This is an incredible device. You can access the internet, the web. It's a phone, it's a compass, it's a GPS. There was an article that listed the 50 major items that the iPhone replaced, and that's what this picture is from. Steve Jobs, this is one of the things he pioneered, but Steve Jobs became incredibly wealthy, not because he stole from us, which would probably be a surprise if you've been watching the Democrat presidential debates. But, Jeff Bezos, Henry Ford, Steve Jobs, they became incredibly wealthy because they provided us with tremendous benefits. In a capitalist economy, the more you benefit individuals, the more you benefit consumers, the more you benefit yourself, right? Now, that's not what I would call pure charitable conduct, right? But it's a whole lot closer to benevolent because you want to improve your life. There's some self-motivation here. But it's a whole lot closer to benevolence than it is to greed. What about a socialist economy? What does a socialist economy do? Well, it does just the opposite. It focuses all your energy on you, on yourself, because you're competing with everybody else in that economy for the most you can get of the limited supply of goods, services, or benefits that the government makes available. If you're standing in a bread line, you're standing, and they always have bread lines because socialist economies can't produce enough food for people to eat. If you're standing in the bread line, you're not thinking about the person in front of you or behind you. You're not trying to think how you can feed them or what products you could come up with that they would like. You're trying to think how you will get the most for yourself when you get to the end of that line. The same is true whether you're waiting in line for gas or government rationed health care. It's how you can get the most for yourself. And how do you get the most for yourself? Well, in a capitalist society like the United States, you do it by satisfying the people that control the economy, which is all of you. It's consumers. In a socialist economy, you do it by satisfying the political elites, because they're the ones who determine how much you can get. And if you're willing and able to make them happy, you will get more for yourself and your family. Right, so let's think about it. There really isn't enough wealth in any of these countries for there to be a big elite class. There's always a small elite class. But let's take North Korea, for example. You got Kim Jong-un running North Korea, right? People are starving. Children are starving. Everybody's malnourished. Does it look like this guy's missed a meal recently? Or how about Maduro in Venezuela? There's disease spreading through Colombia and Brazil. That we thought were wiped out centuries ago. People, again, are starving. I read an article in the New York Times that parents are actually killing the family pets and eating them. Could you imagine feeding your kids their dog or their cat or whatever pet they happen to have? Does it look like Maduro and his buddies are eating their kids are eating their pets? I don't think so. And people are starving again in Venezuela. Venezuela in 2010 was the richest country in South America. It sits on an ocean of oil. How do you sit on an ocean of oil and have your people starving? See, that's the benevolence of socialism. This is Caracas. I showed this a couple of weeks ago at a presentation. Somebody asked if it was actually San Francisco. But it's Caracas, right? This is the benevolence of socialism. Now, to avoid the obvious historical failures of socialism everywhere and every time it's ever been tried, Bernie Sanders is out there, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We're not Denmark, or we're not Venezuela, we're not North Korea, we're not Cuba, we're Denmark. Right, we're Denmark. We're democratic socialists like Denmark. Only one problem with that. Denmark is a capitalist country. And Mac, in fact, they get angry when you say they're a socialist country. In 2016, when Bernie was running around the country going, by the way, I was number 3 on Bernie's list, his enemies list that he came out with recently. One of the things I'm proud of in my career. But anyway, Bernie's been running around saying he's Denmark. Well, the Prime Minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen of Denmark, came to the United States and said, I know some people in the U.S. associate the Nordic model with some sort of socialism. I'd like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. It's a market economy. In fact, the Heritage Foundation has an index of economic freedom they come out with every year. Denmark, of the 180 countries on that list, by the way, North Korea, Venezuela, and Cuba are the least free. Denmark is number 14. They're the 14th freest economy in the world. The United States is number 12. I mean, this is a free market economy, and you know it's a free market economy because they have very generous welfare benefits. They have very high taxes, but very generous welfare benefits. The only way they could pay for those welfare benefits is if they had a capitalist economy, because if you had a socialist economy, you could just promise them, you could never pay for them. In Denmark, they actually pay for them. So we know with capitalism and socialism, when you have capitalism, you have entrepreneurial energy, you have people voting, you have abundance, right? You have prosperity. We know with socialism, traditionally, you have poverty and want. But does capitalism really spread the benefits beyond the wealthy? I want to show you, this chart was prepared by the Angus Madison Foundation. Angus Madison was an historical economist. So he looked back. Most economists look forward. He looked back. He went back to the year 0 and measured GDP per capita. Now that sounds complicated, but it's just economic output per person. Economists like to make you think they're smarter than they are. It's just economic output per person from the year 0. And you can see around 1800, it just surges up. Right? This is an incredible chart. Jonathan Haidt, who you may have heard of, professor at NYU, called this the most important graph in the world. Right? This affected your grandparents, your great-grandparents. It affected you. It affected your parents. It will affect your children and your grandchildren. This is an amazing lifting up of people across the world. Well, I showed it to a millennial son of mine, and he said, no, Dad, that was just the Industrial Revolution. You're going to say it was capitalism, but it was the Industrial Revolution. So I had to show him another chart. This one breaks it down by region. And you can see that the first country in the world to shoot up, the green one, is the United States. And it happens right around the time that we ratify the Constitution. Why? Well, there was two fortuitous events in 1776, the Declaration of Independence, and Adam Smith comes out with The Wealth of Nations, a book that explained why you would set up a modern capitalist economy and how it would work. The Founding Fathers adopted Adam Smith's perspective. We had a free market economy. From the year we ratified the Constitution in 1790, by 1885, less than 100 years, we went from 13 backwoods colonies on the coast of North America to the world's largest economy. And we have been the world's largest economy ever since. What about Great Britain? They had an industrial revolution. Western Europe, they went up some. You can see they're the blue line. And then after World War II, they just shoot up. Well, those of you that aren't millennials and actually had an education will know that that coincided with the end of World War II and the fall of the National Socialist Party, which was the Nazi Party. Right? The Nazis were proud socialists. That collapsed. Western Europe shot up. How about Japan? That's the second most important line on this chart next to the USA. End of World War II, MacArthur goes in, sets up a democracy and a capitalist economy. Japan not only shoots up for the first time in history, it passes Western Europe. Eastern Europe shoots up. When? Fall of the Soviet Union, the world's largest socialist economy. China shoots up. When? When it adopts red capitalism. It's not even real capitalism, and they still go up. Right? So we know that capitalism was what drove that incredible hockey chart up. Right? But did the money get to people, or did the money just stay with the wealthy? Well, the World Bank came up with a chart. This chart shows people living in extreme poverty. 94% of the world lived in extreme poverty in 1820, right? 94 out of every 100 people. By 2015, it's down to 10. The numbers came out for 2018 about a month ago. It's down to 8.6. It's due to the spread of free markets and capitalism. It significantly reduced extreme poverty. I had a buddy of mine take the World Bank data and the data from that showed the GDP per capita shooting up. And I had him put them together to see if there was a correlation. He said he's never seen a correlation this direct. The blue line, GDP per capita increasing. The red line, extreme poverty decreasing. Show you one more chart. This is a chart that was prepared by an Austrian historian and economist based on the World Bank data. And it shows since the fall of the Soviet Union what's happened with poverty, hunger, illiteracy, child mortality, and pollution. They've all dropped like a rock. What it doesn't tell you is that during that period of time, the world added 2 billion people. So 2 billion people. And what did capitalism, what did free markets do? They drove down poverty, they drove down hunger, and there were fewer babies dying. That's the benevolence of capitalism. Now, why is that? Well, it's because capitalism focuses on dividing a larger and larger pie, economic growth, right? Rather than focusing on more equally dividing a smaller and smaller pie, which is what socialism does. John F. Kennedy really nailed it. He had a very famous quote. He said, "A rising tide lifts all boats." Now, Kennedy couldn't get elected today. He couldn't even get nominated. They wouldn't even be talking about him. Because what he was saying was that a rising tide lifts everybody's economic boat. He was arguing for tax cuts. Actually, the largest tax cuts we've ever had to that point in time. Only Reagan and Trump had bigger tax cuts. But this is a rising tide that lifts all boats, meaning it lifts the working poor, it lifts those in poverty, it lifts the working class, the middle class, the upper class. Everybody goes up. Why is that such an anathema to those on the left, to the liberals, to the Democrats, to the progressives? Because it eliminates the need for class warfare. If we're all better off, there's no need for class warfare, right? Everybody does better. And today in America, guess what? Everybody's doing better. From the time Obama was president until today, we've gone from 18th freest country in the world we were 5th when Obama took over. Now that we were 18th when he left. We're now up to 12th. President Trump's moving us up. And you hear the numbers, 159 million people employed, the most in the history of ever. We've never had that many people employed. 3.5% unemployment rate, the lowest in 50 years. We had lows in unemployment this year for African Americans, Hispanic, Asians, women, people with only a high school education, the handicapped, veterans. Everybody's doing better. And the amazing thing is, we have 1 million more job openings last month than we had people unemployed. And it was the 16th month and the last 17th month where there'd been over 1 million job openings more than people unemployed. Now think about that. When Obama left office, we had 1.9 million more people unemployed than we had job openings. Now we've got 1 million more job openings than people unemployed. That's a complete turnaround. I called it the capitalist comeback in my book. It's the kind of turnaround you just never see. Imagine in 3 years. 3 years ago, 3% of the people rated the economy as excellent. They were all Obama's and Biden's relatives. Now it's 20%, right? 20%. This is an incredible turnaround. So I always end these discussions by saying I have great news for young Americans. I have great news for all Americans, which is that the economic system under which we live is the greatest economic system ever devised. It encourages our farmers, to feed the world, because by feeding the world, they can better feed themselves and their families. It encourages entrepreneurs to rebuild inner cities because by opening new restaurants, new hotels, new drugstores, they can not only lift up their communities, but they can lift themselves up and their families. It's the best system ever devised for the poor and the marginalized. Right? It empowers them to vote with every dollar they spend, and it creates the opportunities that can lift them from the working poor or the working class to any class they want to go to. It's called capitalism. Capitalism and the American dream are the next generations, whether it's millennials, Gen Z, Gen X. It's their generation to either defend. They can defend our political, religious, and economic liberties, or they can let them fall to the centrists. That's completely up to them. As a matter of fact, as Ronald Reagan said, freedom is only one generation away from extinction. I don't know whether millennials will be that generation. I can't tell you. I can tell you I think we all have an obligation. I think we have an obligation to go out and tell them what their professors, what their college professors, what the academics, what the Hollywood elites don't want them to know, which is that capitalism is moral, capitalism is benevolent, and capitalism is right. Now, I pray that God will bless the upcoming generations, and give them the wisdom they need as they take over the mantle of defending the greatest nation that's ever existed in the history of the world. I pray that God will bless each of you and that God will bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.